A Fistful of Dollars, 1964, was conceived in an era when the Western genre was undergoing significant changes, but its roots can be traced back to both American and international cinematic traditions. The film was heavily influenced by Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo, 1961, a Japanese samurai film that featured a wandering ronin playing two rival factions against each other in a desolate town. While this premise had been used in storytelling before, particularly in Dashiell Hammett's novel Red Harvest, 1929, Yojimbo's gritty, stylized violence and morally ambiguous protagonist provided a fresh take on the theme, one that deeply resonated with a young Italian director named Sergio Leone. Leone, who had grown up admiring American westerns from directors like John Ford and Howard Hawks, recognized that the genre had become increasingly stagnant, particularly in Hollywood, where traditional heroism and black-and-white morality dominated the narrative. Italian filmmakers had begun producing their own versions of westerns, but they were often considered low-budget imitations, lacking the stylistic innovations and artistic depth that Leone envisioned. Inspired by Kurosawa's film, Leone saw an opportunity to create a western that was raw, violent, and distinct from its American counterparts, using an anti-hero who relied more on cunning and strategy rather than pure virtue. However, adapting Yojimbo into a western required significant adjustments, especially since Leone had to work within the constraints of the Italian and Spanish film industries, which had smaller budgets and less access to high-profile actors. At the time, American studios dominated the Western genre, making it difficult for European filmmakers to break through, but Leone saw a potential niche. By shooting in Spain, he could recreate the rugged landscapes of the American West at a fraction of the cost. The script was altered to fit a more arid, lawless setting, replacing samurai with gunslingers, feudal Japan with a Mexican border town, and katanas with revolvers. Leone initially struggled to find a producer willing to back the project, as the Western genre was not a major force in European cinema, and many financiers doubted that an Italian-made Western could compete with Hollywood's dominance. Furthermore, Kurosawa's Yojimbo had not yet been widely recognized outside Japan, which allowed Leone some creative leeway in borrowing elements without immediate legal concerns. Leone's approach was radical. Rather than following the grand, sweeping narratives of classic American Westerns, he envisioned a stark, minimalist world filled with brutal, selfish characters where morality was a mere afterthought. His reinterpretation of the genre was not only influenced by Kurosawa but also by the violent Italian comic books of the time, particularly the fumetti neri, which often featured anti-heroes and grim narratives. Additionally, Leone drew inspiration from the cynical worldview of post-war Italian cinema, particularly the works of directors like Federico Fellini and Michelangelo Antonioni, who explored themes of existentialism and alienation. By combining these influences, Leone crafted a blueprint for what would later become the spaghetti western, a grittier, more operatic take on the genre that relied on visual storytelling, extreme close-ups, and sudden bursts of violence. The film's main character, later known as the Man with No Name, was deliberately designed to be enigmatic and devoid of traditional heroism, a stark contrast to the righteous cowboys of John Wayne's era. Leone wanted a protagonist who was more like a hired gun than a noble lawman, someone who operated outside the bounds of morality and who could navigate a corrupt world by his own rules. While the idea of a lone drifter manipulating rival factions was lifted directly from Yojimbo, Leone infused the concept with his own stylistic flourishes, making the story less about a samurai's honor and more about a gunslinger's survival in a lawless, capitalist wasteland. This shift in tone marked a significant departure from Hollywood's sanitized portrayal of the Wild West, signaling the arrival of a new kind of Western that would eventually redefine the genre. However, Leone's vision was still far from realization, as he needed a team of actors, a composer, and a crew who could bring his ideas to life. He also faced the challenge of adapting a distinctly Japanese narrative into a form that would resonate with European and American audiences, requiring extensive changes to the script, setting, and character dynamics. Despite these obstacles, Leone remained committed to his idea, believing that a new kind of Western, one defined by stark realism, moral ambiguity, and operatic violence, could captivate audiences in a way that traditional Hollywood Westerns no longer could. His next challenge would be assembling the cast and crew, particularly finding the right actor to embody the mysterious gunslinger at the heart of his film. With the conceptual foundation of A Fistful of Dollars in place, Sergio Leone now faced the monumental task of bringing his vision to life, but this journey was riddled with obstacles, from budget constraints to creative clashes. Leone had a clear idea of what he wanted, a Western that felt more visceral and operatic than anything Hollywood had produced, stripped of the moral absolutism that defined the John Wayne era. However, securing funding for such a project in Italy was no easy feat, as westerns were not considered commercially viable outside of America, and many financiers were reluctant to back a film that diverged so sharply from traditional genre conventions. To cut costs, Leone decided to film in Spain, particularly in Almeria, where the arid landscapes closely resembled the American Southwest, but even with this decision, financial backing remained a challenge. The film's budget was initially set at a meager $200,000, a fraction of what Hollywood westerns typically cost, which meant that Leone had to employ a mix of Italian, Spanish, and German production teams to maximize resources. The lack of funds influenced every aspect of production, from set design to cinematography, forcing Leone to innovate where others might have compromised. He chose to use abandoned villages as filming locations, repurposing existing structures to create the illusion of a fully realized town, and relied on tight, extreme close-ups and rapid editing to disguise the limitations of his sets. These stylistic choices, which would later become Leone's trademarks, were born out of necessity rather than design, proving that constraints often breed creativity. Leone also had to contend with script revisions, as the original story borrowed heavily from Yojimbo, requiring modifications to avoid direct accusations of plagiarism. The screenplay, initially titled Il Magnifico Straniero, The Magnificent Stranger, underwent multiple revisions as Leone adapted the samurai narrative into a Western context, replacing katanas with revolvers and feudal lords with Mexican bandits. However, since Yojimbo had not been widely seen outside Japan at the time, Leone felt confident that his version was distinct enough to stand on its own, though this assumption would later lead to a legal battle with Akira Kurosawa. In addition to narrative adjustments, Leone wanted his film to stand out visually, developing a unique aesthetic that blended stark realism with heightened cinematic grandeur. He experimented with wide shots that exaggerated the desolation of the landscape, juxtaposed with extreme close-ups that captured every twitch and bead of sweat on an actor's face, creating an almost surreal sense of tension. This visual language was unlike anything seen in previous westerns, where directors typically favored mid-range compositions that maintained a clear sense of geography. Leone's approach was more fragmented, emphasizing atmosphere and mood over conventional spatial continuity, an innovation that would later define the spaghetti western genre. Despite his ambitions, Leone struggled to find a distributor willing to take a chance on his film, as many studios dismissed it as a low-budget imitation of American westerns. He eventually secured a deal with the small Italian production company Jolly Film, but their financial support was minimal, forcing Leone to stretch every lira as far as possible. The lack of resources extended to the film's wardrobe and props, which had to be scavenged and reused between scenes to maintain continuity. Leone's determination to create a new kind of western extended beyond visuals and budgetary constraints. He was also deeply involved in shaping the tone and pacing of the film, favoring long, drawn-out sequences punctuated by sudden bursts of violence. This slow-burn approach was a stark contrast to the rapid pacing of Hollywood westerns, where action sequences were typically choreographed with rhythmic precision. Leone wanted gunfights to feel weighty and unpredictable, with each shot reverberating like a cannon blast rather than the clean, stylized exchanges seen in American films. His emphasis on raw, unpolished action scenes set the stage for a more brutal, grounded depiction of the Old West, one where death came suddenly and without the romanticism often attached to duels. However, Leone's insistence on breaking away from Hollywood conventions put him at odds with traditionalist producers, who feared that his unorthodox approach would alienate audiences. These tensions forced Leone to defend his creative choices constantly, arguing that audiences were ready for a grittier, more realistic take on the genre. Despite the pushback, Leone refused to compromise his vision, believing that his style would resonate with viewers in ways that conventional westerns no longer could. Another major challenge was securing actors who could bring his characters to life, especially since he was working with an international cast that spoke different languages. Since A Fistful of Dollars was being filmed in multiple languages to accommodate European distribution, actors often delivered their lines in their native tongues, with final dialogue dubbed in post-production. This multilingual approach created logistical difficulties, as performers struggled to match their delivery with the intended tone of the script. Leone was particularly meticulous about how dialogue was spoken, often instructing actors to slow down their speech to create a more dramatic rhythm, even if it made conversations feel unnaturally paced. This stylistic decision contributed to the film's dreamlike quality, where conversations felt almost hypnotic, punctuated by long silences that heightened the tension between characters. Despite these hurdles, Leone pressed forward, convinced that he was crafting something revolutionary. He knew that finding the right lead actor was crucial, as the entire film hinged on the presence of the man with no name, a mysterious, laconic gunslinger who exuded cool detachment and effortless dominance. Leone originally sought out established Hollywood actors like Henry Fonda, Charles Bronson, and James Coburn for the role, but they either declined or were too expensive for the film's modest budget. Desperate for a lead, Leone eventually stumbled upon Clint Eastwood, a relatively unknown television actor at the time, whose role in Rawhide had given him some experience with westerns. Though not Leone's first choice, Eastwood possessed a quiet intensity and a rugged demeanor that fit the character perfectly. He also came at an affordable price, making him the ideal candidate for a film with severe financial limitations. However, convincing Eastwood to take the role required some persuasion, as he was initially hesitant about starring in a low-budget Italian western. Eventually, Eastwood agreed, intrigued by the opportunity to break free from his clean-cut television image and take on a more morally ambiguous role. With Eastwood on board, Leone's vision was finally beginning to materialize, but the road ahead remained fraught with challenges, from difficult filming conditions in the scorching Spanish desert to clashes between Leone's meticulous directing style and Eastwood's minimalist approach to acting. Despite the odds stacked against him, Leone remained unwavering in his belief that A Fistful of Dollars would redefine the Western genre, paving the way for a new era of filmmaking that blended European artistry with American iconography. As production moved forward, it became clear that this would not be a conventional shoot. Leone's insistence on perfection, coupled with the film's limited resources, meant that every scene had to be executed with precision and ingenuity. What began as a passion project on the fringes of the industry was slowly transforming into a cinematic revolution, one that would challenge the dominance of Hollywood westerns and introduce the world to a new kind of anti-hero. But before A Fistful of Dollars could make history, Leone had to endure one of the most grueling productions of his career, where every decision, no matter how small, could mean the difference between success and failure. With the foundation of A Fistful of Dollars set in place, Sergio Leone turned his attention to assembling a cast that could bring his vision to life, but this process was anything but straightforward. The most critical casting decision was finding an actor to portray the enigmatic gunslinger at the heart of the story, a character who would later be known as the Man with No Name. Leone initially sought established Hollywood stars like Henry Fonda, who had previously played both heroic and villainous roles in westerns, but Fonda's asking price was far beyond the film's meager budget. Charles Bronson was also approached, but he dismissed the script outright, calling it a bad copy of Yojimbo and showing little interest in working on an Italian production. James Coburn was another potential candidate, but his salary demands were similarly prohibitive. Leone, determined to find a lead actor who could embody the silent, calculating nature of his protagonist, was forced to search outside the mainstream Hollywood circuit. His search eventually led him to Clint Eastwood, a relatively unknown television actor best known for his role in the long-running Western series Rawhide. While Eastwood had experience with Westerns, his character in Rawhide was far from the morally ambiguous anti-hero Leone had envisioned. He was a clean-cut, law-abiding cowboy, a stark contrast to the ruthless, pragmatic gunslinger of A Fistful of Dollars. However, Eastwood was eager to break away from his television persona and was intrigued by the opportunity to star in a film that allowed him to play a darker, more complex character. Leone, in turn, saw potential in Eastwood's quiet intensity and rugged demeanor, believing that his minimalist acting style would complement the film's sparse dialogue and heavy reliance on visual storytelling. Eastwood was offered $15,000 for the role, an amount significantly lower than what bigger stars demanded, making him an affordable choice for the film's tight budget. After reading the script, Eastwood agreed to the role, seeing it as an opportunity to reinvent himself as a leading man. However, his decision to star in an Italian Western was met with skepticism in Hollywood, where European productions were often dismissed as inferior imitations of American films. Despite the doubts, Eastwood embraced the challenge, bringing his own creative contributions to the role, including the character's now iconic costume. Wanting to distance himself from traditional Western heroes, Eastwood personally selected the poncho, hat, and cigarillos that became defining elements of his character's image. The poncho, in particular, was chosen for its distinctive look and practicality, as it allowed Eastwood to subtly conceal his movements during gunfights, adding an air of mystery to his persona. The cigars, which Eastwood hand-rolled himself, became another signature element, giving his character a rugged, weathered appearance while also serving as a visual prop that added to his nonchalant demeanor. These small but deliberate choices helped shape the Man with No Name into an iconic figure, one whose image would be imitated and referenced in countless films to come. Once Eastwood was on board, Leone turned to casting the supporting roles, particularly the film's antagonists. Since A Fistful of Dollars was a European production, The cast was composed of actors from various countries, requiring a multilingual approach to filming. Leone selected Gian Maria Volante, a respected Italian stage and film actor, to play Ramon Rojo, the primary villain. Volante was known for his theatrical performances and brought an intense, almost operatic quality to his role, contrasting sharply with Eastwood's restrained, minimalist approach. Unlike Eastwood, who preferred subtle facial expressions and minimal dialogue, Volante embraced a more expressive style, often delivering his lines with exaggerated gestures and dramatic intensity. This contrast between the two actors created a compelling dynamic on screen, with Eastwood's cold, detached gunslinger serving as the perfect foil to Volante's fiery, unpredictable antagonist. However, the differences in their acting styles also led to tensions on set, as Volante reportedly found Eastwood's lack of overt emotion frustrating, while Eastwood, in turn, viewed Volante's theatricality as excessive. Despite these clashes, the friction between the two actors translated into a palpable on-screen rivalry, enhancing the tension between their characters. Another key casting choice was Marianne Koch, a German actress who played Marisol, a woman caught in the crossfire between the rival factions. Unlike the typical love interests found in Hollywood westerns, Marisol was a character defined by her vulnerability and the harsh realities of life in a lawless town. Her presence added an emotional weight to the story, providing a rare glimpse into the human cost of the violent world Leone was depicting. Koch's performance was understated yet effective, complementing Eastwood's stoic demeanor and adding depth to the film's narrative. The supporting cast also included Joseph Egger as the eccentric coffin maker, a role that provided moments of dark humor, and Wolfgang Luxshey as Sheriff John Baxter, whose attempts to maintain order in the town ultimately proved futile. Each actor contributed to the film's unique atmosphere, helping to create a world that felt both surreal and brutally authentic. Filming presented its own set of challenges, particularly due to the multilingual nature of the production. Since the actors spoke different languages, Eastwood in English, Volante in Italian, Koch in German, and the Spanish actors in their native tongue, dialogue was not recorded on set. Instead, actors spoke their lines in their respective languages, with the film later dubbed into different versions for international release. This approach, while common in European cinema, was unusual for Hollywood actors like Eastwood, who had to adjust to performing scenes without traditional verbal cues. To compensate, Leone placed a heavy emphasis on body language and facial expressions, instructing actors to convey meaning through subtle movements and intense gazes rather than dialogue. This focus on visual storytelling became one of the defining characteristics of Leone's style, creating a cinematic language that transcended linguistic barriers. Eastwood's performance, in particular, was shaped by this approach, as he leaned into the character's silent, brooding nature, allowing his physical presence to speak louder than words. Leone encouraged him to minimize his dialogue, stripping down his lines to the bare essentials and relying on pauses, stares, and smirks to convey meaning. This minimalist approach not only added to the character's mystique but also contributed to the film's deliberate, tension-filled pacing. Unlike traditional Western heroes who delivered lengthy monologues about justice and morality, Eastwood's character operated on a different level. He was a man of few words, whose actions spoke volumes. His calm, calculating demeanor made him feel almost otherworldly, a ghostly figure who drifted into town, disrupted the status quo, and disappeared just as quickly. This reinvention of the Western protagonist was a radical departure from the genre's conventions, setting the stage for a new era of morally ambiguous anti-heroes. As filming progressed, Eastwood and Leone developed a mutual understanding, despite their initial differences. Leone appreciated Eastwood's ability to convey emotion with minimal effort, while Eastwood respected Leone's meticulous attention to detail. However, their working relationship was not without its challenges. Leone's perfectionism often led to lengthy shooting days, with multiple takes required for even the simplest scenes. Eastwood, accustomed to the faster pace of television production, found this approach frustrating at times, but he recognized that Leone's vision required patience and precision. Despite the difficulties, the collaboration between the two men proved to be a defining moment in both of their careers, with Eastwood's performance becoming the blueprint for a new kind of Western protagonist, and Leone's direction setting a new standard for cinematic storytelling. By the time filming wrapped, it was clear that A Fistful of Dollars was unlike any Western that had come before it. The film's unconventional casting choices, multilingual production, and bold visual style all contributed to its uniqueness, laying the groundwork for a cinematic revolution. But before it could make its mark on the world, Leone had to overcome one final challenge: bringing the film to life through music and sound, a task that would fall into the hands of a composer whose work would become as legendary as the film itself, Ennio Morricone. With casting complete and the creative vision set in motion, the production of A Fistful of Dollars moved into its most grueling phase: filming. Given the film's limited budget, Sergio Leone had to be resourceful with every decision, from location scouting to cinematography techniques. Instead of shooting in the American West, which would have been prohibitively expensive, Leone and his team opted for Spain, specifically the arid landscapes of Almeria, a region whose rugged terrain closely resembled the deserts of the southwestern United States and northern Mexico. Almeria had already been used in a handful of European westerns, but A Fistful of Dollars would solidify its reputation as the go-to location for spaghetti westerns. Leone also utilized locations in Hoyo de Manzanares, near Madrid, where a small village set was built to represent the fictional town of San Miguel. The set design was sparse, reflecting the town's bleak, lawless atmosphere, with crumbling adobe walls, dusty streets, and a saloon that doubled as a gathering place for both villains and victims. These practical, cost-effective choices helped create an immersive setting that felt both authentic and stylized, a visual blend of realism and myth-making that became one of Leone's defining trademarks. The filming process itself was anything but smooth. The cast and crew had to endure scorching heat during the day and freezing temperatures at night, making long shooting schedules physically exhausting. The budgetary limitations meant that production could not afford the luxuries of major Hollywood films. There were no elaborate trailers or catered meals, and actors often had to make do with minimal accommodations. Clint Eastwood, for example, brought his own clothing and props to set, including the now iconic poncho, which he never washed throughout the entire shoot to maintain continuity. This dedication to authenticity extended to other aspects of production as well. Leone insisted on using real dust and gunpowder effects rather than relying on Hollywood-style special effects, which added a raw, unfiltered quality to the film's action sequences. One of the most distinctive aspects of A Fistful of Dollars was Leone's revolutionary cinematographic approach, which blended sweeping wide shots with extreme close-ups to create a unique visual language. Inspired by both Akira Kurosawa's dynamic framing in Yojimbo and the operatic intensity of Italian cinema, Leone crafted a style that emphasized tension and atmosphere over traditional narrative exposition. His use of close-ups was particularly striking. Leone would linger on the smallest details, such as a character's narrowed eyes, the sweat dripping down a gunfighter's face, or the subtle twitch of a trigger finger. These intense close-ups were contrasted with vast, empty landscapes, heightening the sense of isolation and danger that defined the film's world. Leone's cinematographer, Massimo Dallamano, played a crucial role in executing this vision, employing innovative camera angles and lighting techniques that made the film feel both grand and intimate. The lighting was often harsh and unfiltered, casting deep shadows that accentuated the rugged, sun-scorched look of the characters and locations. This aesthetic choice was a deliberate departure from the polished, technicolor gloss of Hollywood westerns, further reinforcing the film's gritty, unforgiving tone. Another challenge during filming was coordinating the multilingual cast. Since A Fistful of Dollars was an Italian-Spanish-German co-production, the actors spoke their lines in their native languages, which led to an unusual dynamic on set. Clint Eastwood delivered his dialogue in English, while John Maria Vallant, Ramon Rojo, and most of the supporting cast spoke Italian or Spanish. This language barrier sometimes created confusion, as actors had to rely on cues rather than direct verbal responses to maintain the flow of scenes. To work around this, Leone focused heavily on visual storytelling, ensuring that body language, facial expressions, and movement carried as much weight as spoken dialogue. This decision not only helped streamline production but also contributed to the film's distinctive style, where silence and subtle gestures became just as powerful as words. The lack of synchronized sound also meant that all dialogue and sound effects had to be dubbed in post-production, a standard practice in Italian cinema but one that felt unusual to American audiences when the film was eventually released in the United States. One of the most iconic sequences in the film, the final showdown between Eastwood's character and Ramon Rojo, was a perfect example of Leone's meticulous direction and his ability to build tension through cinematic language rather than conventional storytelling techniques. In this scene, Leone utilized long, drawn-out pacing, extreme close-ups, and Ennio Morricone's haunting score to heighten the drama. The sequence begins with a slow, deliberate approach as the two men face off in the center of town, their eyes locked in an unspoken battle of wills. Leone lingers on their faces, capturing every subtle expression, every twitch of a muscle, stretching time to its breaking point. When the gunfire finally erupts, it is brutal and sudden, a violent punctuation mark that shatters the agonizing silence. This method of building tension, holding a moment for as long as possible before releasing it in a sudden burst of action, became one of Leone's most influential stylistic choices, later emulated by countless filmmakers, including Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez. The technical limitations of the production also forced Leone to improvise in ways that ultimately contributed to the film's distinct aesthetic. For instance, the film's modest budget meant that expensive crane shots or elaborate tracking shots were out of the question, so Leone and Dallamano relied on handheld camera work and creative framing to achieve dynamic movement within scenes. The use of slow zooms, exaggerated perspective shifts, and stark, minimalist compositions gave A Fistful of Dollars a striking visual identity, one that set it apart from both classic Hollywood westerns and traditional European cinema. Leone also experimented with unconventional editing techniques, using jump cuts and abrupt scene transitions to create a sense of disorientation and unpredictability. These stylistic choices, though partially born out of necessity, would later become hallmarks of the spaghetti western genre, influencing filmmakers around the world. Despite the numerous challenges faced during production, Leone's determination never wavered. He was relentless in his pursuit of perfection, often demanding multiple takes of the same shot to ensure that every frame met his exacting standards. His meticulous approach extended to even the smallest details. He was known for personally arranging set decorations, adjusting actors' costumes, and fine-tuning camera angles to achieve the precise visual effect he envisioned. This obsessive attention to detail sometimes led to conflicts on set, particularly with John Maria Vallant, who grew frustrated with Leone's demands for repeated takes. Vallant, a classically trained actor, was used to a more theatrical style of performance, and he often clashed with Leone over the director's insistence on restraint and minimalism. Eastwood, by contrast, adapted more readily to Leone's style, recognizing that the power of his character came from what was left unsaid rather than what was explicitly stated. As filming wrapped, the crew had little idea that they had just completed a film that would revolutionize the Western genre. The production had been grueling, plagued by budgetary constraints, harsh filming conditions, and creative tensions, but Leone had succeeded in crafting a film that felt entirely new, a Western that was both a tribute to and a subversion of the genre's conventions. Now, with the footage in the can, the next step was to bring the film to life through music and sound, a task that would fall to one of Leone's most important collaborators, Ennio Morricone. Leone knew that the right score could elevate A Fistful of Dollars from a low-budget genre film to something truly iconic, and in Morricone, he found a composer who could translate his cinematic vision into an unforgettable musical experience. The collaboration between Leone and Morricone would go on to define not just A Fistful of Dollars but the entire spaghetti western movement, forever changing the way music was used in film. As the visual elements of A Fistful of Dollars took shape, Sergio Leone knew that the film's atmosphere would not be complete without a groundbreaking musical score. Unlike traditional Hollywood westerns, which relied on grand orchestral compositions reminiscent of American frontier ballads, Leone wanted something radically different. Music that would not only complement the film's stark, violent aesthetic but also enhance its mythic, almost surreal quality. This led him to Ennio Morricone, a then-rising Italian composer whose innovative approach to film scoring would redefine the relationship between music and cinema. The collaboration between Leone and Morricone was both serendipitous and transformative, marking the beginning of one of the most iconic director-composer partnerships in film history. Morricone, who had already experimented with unconventional sounds in previous works, immediately understood Leone's vision and set out to create a score that was as bold and unorthodox as the film itself. One of the most revolutionary aspects of Morricone's approach was his rejection of traditional Western musical tropes in favor of a minimalist, avant-garde soundscape. Instead of relying solely on orchestral arrangements, he incorporated a mix of unusual instruments, human voices, and non-musical elements to create an auditory experience that was both haunting and exhilarating. The score prominently featured whistling, whip cracks, gunshots, bells, and even animalistic grunts, blending them into a rhythmic composition that mirrored the film's deliberate pacing. Morricone also introduced the use of the electric guitar, an instrument rarely heard in Western scores of the time, which gave the music an edgy, contemporary feel that contrasted sharply with the period setting. This blend of traditional and modern elements made the soundtrack feel both timeless and experimental, adding to the film's surreal, almost dreamlike atmosphere. Leone and Morricone worked closely together to ensure that the music was not just an accompaniment to the film but an integral part of its storytelling. Unlike most directors, who typically add music after a film is edited, Leone often structured his scenes around Morricone's compositions, allowing the rhythm of the music to dictate the movement of the characters and the timing of the action. This approach was particularly evident in the film's gunfight sequences, where Morricone's score played a crucial role in building tension. For example, in the climactic duel between the Man with No Name and Ramon Rojo, the music starts with a slow, deliberate beat, mirroring the measured pacing of the scene as the two men size each other up. As the standoff intensifies, the music swells, incorporating sharp trumpet blasts and eerie choral chants that heighten the suspense until the final gunshot. This fusion of music and visual storytelling became a defining characteristic of Leone's style and would influence countless filmmakers in the decades to come. One of the most iconic pieces from the score, Titoli, which plays during the film's opening credits, immediately sets the tone for what is to come. The track begins with a distinctive whistling melody, followed by a mix of Spanish-style guitar, echoing gunshots, and a hypnotic drumbeat. This unconventional blend of sounds immediately signals to the audience that A Fistful of Dollars is not a typical Western. It is something new, something raw, something that defies expectations. The whistling motif, performed by Alessandro Alessandroni, became one of Morricone's signature elements, appearing in many of his later scores and influencing the use of whistling in film music across multiple genres. Another standout track, The Result, underscores some of the film's most dramatic moments, using a mix of somber brass and choral voices to create a sense of inevitability and doom. The music not only enhances the film's atmosphere but also serves as an emotional guide, helping the audience navigate the morally ambiguous world of Leone's vision. The innovative use of sound design in A Fistful of Dollars extended beyond Morricone's compositions. Leone was meticulous about how gunshots, footsteps, and environmental noises were presented in the film, opting for exaggerated, stylized sound effects that heightened the impact of every action. Gunfire, for example, was not recorded in a naturalistic way but instead engineered to sound like thunderous explosions, reinforcing the mythic quality of the gunfights. The sounds of spurs jingling, boots scraping against dirt, and wind howling through the empty streets were amplified to create an almost hyper-real auditory experience. This attention to detail was crucial in crafting the film's atmosphere, making every moment feel charged with tension and anticipation. Dialogue, too, was handled in a unique manner. Since the film was shot with a multilingual cast, all dialogue had to be dubbed in post-production, a common practice in Italian cinema but one that felt unusual to American audiences. Clint Eastwood, for example, delivered his lines in English, while John Maria Vallant and the Spanish actors spoke Italian and Spanish, respectively. In the Italian version of the film, Eastwood's lines were dubbed by an Italian actor, while in the English version, the rest of the cast's dialogue was re-recorded by English-speaking voice actors. This process sometimes led to awkward lip-syncing, but it also contributed to the film's dreamlike, slightly surreal quality, where characters seemed to exist in a world that was just slightly removed from reality. Leone embraced this stylized approach, often encouraging actors to speak more slowly than natural conversation would dictate, allowing room for dramatic pauses and meaningful silences. Despite the film's experimental approach to sound and music, or perhaps because of it, A Fistful of Dollars created a template that would be widely imitated in later westerns and action films. Morricone's score, in particular, had a lasting impact on the genre, influencing composers like John Williams, Hans Zimmer, and even modern electronic musicians who drew inspiration from his use of unconventional instrumentation. Leone and Morricone's collaboration would continue in For a Few Dollars More, 1965, and The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, 1966. Each time refining and expanding upon the musical and auditory techniques first pioneered in A Fistful of Dollars. However, as the film neared completion, one final challenge loomed over its release. A legal battle that threatened to derail everything Leone had worked for. Akira Kurosawa, upon discovering the striking similarities between A Fistful of Dollars and Yojimbo, took legal action against Leone and the film's producers, claiming copyright infringement. This lawsuit, combined with initial skepticism from distributors, cast uncertainty over whether the film would ever reach a wide audience. Yet, against all odds, A Fistful of Dollars would not only survive but go on to redefine the Western genre, influencing generations of filmmakers and solidifying its place as a cinematic masterpiece. The battle for the film's legitimacy and its eventual global impact would become the final chapter in its tumultuous journey, a story of legal conflicts, unexpected success, and an enduring legacy that reshaped cinema forever. As A Fistful of Dollars neared its completion, its future seemed uncertain, and not just because of the challenges faced during its production. Despite the film's innovative approach to filmmaking and the vision that Sergio Leone, Clint Eastwood, and Ennio Morricone had brought to life, there was a shadow hanging over the film in the form of legal challenges. Akira Kurosawa, the renowned Japanese director of Yojimbo, took issue with the striking similarities between Leone's film and his own work. Kurosawa's film, released 3 years earlier, had introduced a lone, wandering samurai to audiences, a character who manipulated two feuding factions against each other. This concept, though not entirely unique, was notably replicated in A Fistful of Dollars, where Eastwood's character, an equally mysterious and morally ambiguous gunslinger, played both sides of a conflict between rival factions in a border town. Kurosawa's lawyers argued that Leone had effectively plagiarized Yojimbo's plot and visual motifs, prompting a legal battle between the two filmmakers. The lawsuit brought to light the fact that Leone had, in fact, borrowed quite heavily from the Japanese director's film. However, the circumstances surrounding the case were complicated by the fact that Yojimbo had not yet been widely released outside of Japan, meaning that Leone had likely been unaware of its commercial success or full impact on international audiences. Despite the legal issue, the similarity between the films was undeniable, and this led to a settlement between the two parties. As part of the agreement, Kurosawa received a settlement payment, and the case was resolved without major long-term legal consequences. However, the settlement did little to slow down the momentum of A Fistful of Dollars and its inevitable success. While this legal conflict raged in the background, the film was prepared for release in Italy, where it was first shown in 1964. Initially, A Fistful of Dollars was met with skepticism by Italian audiences, who were used to more traditional westerns and less violent portrayals of the Old West. However, the film quickly found an audience, particularly among younger viewers who were drawn to its raw, visceral action, anti-hero protagonist, and stark, almost nihilistic worldview. Leone's innovative use of pacing, visuals, and sound stood out in stark contrast to the formulaic Hollywood westerns that had dominated the genre for decades. Italian critics, too, began to take notice, appreciating the film's boldness and stylistic flourishes. It wasn't long before the film's success in Italy attracted the attention of international distributors. When A Fistful of Dollars made its way to America, it initially faced resistance from American studios who, like many in the film industry, were hesitant to embrace the spaghetti western trend that was sweeping across Europe. The film's low-budget, unconventional aesthetic, and controversial subject matter were viewed as risky, and many distributors questioned whether American audiences would accept a foreign western with a largely unknown cast. However, the film's reception quickly proved otherwise. Upon its release in the U.S. in 1967, the film was marketed as a film from the producers of The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly, which created a strong connection with audiences familiar with later spaghetti westerns. Though it was initially considered a B-movie in the U.S., it achieved tremendous box office success, earning more than $14 million, an impressive sum, especially considering its modest production costs. This unexpected success demonstrated that audiences were ready for a different kind of western, one that embraced violence, moral ambiguity, and a new kind of heroism that was far from the clean-cut figures of classic American westerns. The commercial success of A Fistful of Dollars marked a turning point for both Sergio Leone and Clint Eastwood. For Leone, it was the beginning of a career-defining trilogy, later followed by For a Few Dollars More, 1965, and The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly, 1966. These films, collectively known as the Dollars Trilogy, cemented Leone's place as a master of the Western genre and solidified his reputation as one of the most influential filmmakers of his time. The trilogy also gave rise to the spaghetti Western movement, which would come to define the 1960s and 1970s in European cinema. Leone's vision for a more violent, morally complex, and visually bold Western resonated not only with European audiences but with American viewers as well, paving the way for a new era of Western films that departed from the traditional portrayals of law and order. For Clint Eastwood, A Fistful of Dollars was a career-defining moment. His portrayal of the man with no name became iconic, and he would go on to embody this character in 2 subsequent films, forever associating him with the spaghetti Western genre. The role transformed Eastwood into a star, and his performance, a masterclass in minimalism, redefined the image of the Western protagonist. The stoic, laconic figure he portrayed, with his grim demeanor and enigmatic silence, became a prototype for countless future anti-heroes in film. Eastwood's success in A Fistful of Dollars opened the door to a long and storied career in both westerns and other genres, eventually making him a household name. His collaboration with Leone not only changed the course of Western cinema but also helped establish Eastwood as one of the most versatile and enduring actors in Hollywood. The success of A Fistful of Dollars also had a profound impact on the Western genre as a whole. The film's gritty, anti-heroic portrayal of the Wild West broke from the conventional portrayals of heroism and morality seen in Hollywood westerns, which often depicted a clear divide between good and evil. By contrast, Leone's world was morally ambiguous, where characters were defined by their self-interest rather than a sense of justice or honor. The violence in A Fistful of Dollars was raw and unflinching, not romanticized but presented as an inevitable part of the harsh, lawless world in which these characters existed. This shift in tone and attitude was reflected in many subsequent westerns, which adopted a darker, more realistic portrayal of the Old West. Leone's influence extended beyond the western genre, affecting the broader landscape of cinema. His use of close-ups, extreme slow motion, and heightened sound design became key elements of action films in the decades that followed. Filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez, and John Woo drew heavily from Leone's work, incorporating his stylistic choices into their own films. Tarantino, in particular, has cited Leone as a major influence on his films, most notably in Kill Bill, 2003, and Django Unchained, 2012, both of which echo the visual and thematic elements of Leone's spaghetti westerns. The film's impact also extended to the music world. Ennio Morricone's score for A Fistful of Dollars became an instant classic, and the film's soundtrack would go on to influence film composers for years to come. Morricone's innovative use of non-traditional instruments, whistling, and rhythmic percussion set a new standard for how music could be used in film, influencing not only Western scores but also scores in action, horror, and even suspense genres. His work with Leone was groundbreaking, and the partnership remains one of the most celebrated in film history. Today, A Fistful of Dollars is considered a landmark in the history of cinema, a film that not only revolutionized the Western genre but also changed the way films were made, scored, and consumed. Its legacy endures in the countless filmmakers who have drawn inspiration from it, in the characters who have followed in the footsteps of the man with no name, and in the genre-defying soundtracks that continue to echo the spirit of Leone and Morricone's work. A Fistful of Dollars not only secured Sergio Leone's place as a visionary director but also helped define the spaghetti western as a cultural phenomenon, ensuring that the film would remain a cornerstone of cinematic history for generations to come.